There was a smell that used to rise up out of a black iron skillet on a summer evening in the deep South, bacon fat meeting cornmeal, that most folks alive today have never once smelled in their whole life. And if you had asked the woman standing over that skillet where the recipe came from, she wouldn't have said a cookbook. She wouldn't have said a chef. She would have said her mama. And her mama would have said her mama, back and back and back, further than anybody wrote down, until you land somewhere in a place with no name on the plantation ledger, a place where a woman with a number instead of a last name figured out how to turn what she was given and what she wasn't given into something that fed a family and kept a spirit alive. That's where this story starts, not in a restaurant, not in a magazine, in the dirt floor kitchens and the smokehouses and the back gardens of enslaved black women and men in the American South who took the parts nobody wanted, the scraps that fell off somebody else's table, and turned them into the food that built the wealthiest cuisine this country has ever produced. And then, and this is the part that'll sit heavy in your chest, this country took that food, put a different face on it, and sold it back to the world without ever saying a single name. I'm going to tell you about 25 dishes tonight. Every single one of them has an owner. Every single one of them has a story. And by the time we get to the last one, you're going to understand something about American food and American memory that most folks never get told. Hey family, I'm James, and if this is your first time sitting with me at this table, welcome. This is where we go back and dig up what got buried, the recipes, the hands, the names history left out. So, before we go one step further, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now. Ring the bell too, if you can. Because what we're about to walk through tonight, you're gonna want to come back for more of this. All right, let's get into it. Number 1, hoecake. Before there was a name for soul food, before anybody was writing cookbooks about the South, there was a woman standing over an open fire with nothing but cornmeal, water, and maybe a spoon of fat if she was lucky that week. She didn't have a proper griddle. What she had was the flat blade of a garden hoe, wiped clean, laid across the coals. And on that hoe, she cooked her bread. That's where the name comes from, family, hoecake, not a metaphor, not a clever name somebody invented later, an actual tool of forced labor turned into a cooking surface. Because that's what was available, and that's what got the job done. The batter would hiss when it hit that hot iron, and in a few minutes, there'd be a crust the color of old leather, and inside it would still be soft, almost sweet from the corn itself. Children ate it for breakfast. Men took it into the fields wrapped in a rag to eat cold at midday with nothing else beside it. It wasn't a treat. It was survival, cooked fast, cooked cheap, cooked with whatever hand was near the fire. And yet, you go into a southern restaurant today, a nice one, white tablecloth, and you'll find hoecakes on the menu for $12, served with honey butter, and not one word on that menu about where the name came from, or whose hands invented it out of necessity. Number 2, collard greens and the pot liquor underneath them. Now, Big Mama used to say the greens weren't the best part. The pot liquor was. That dark green broth left in the bottom of the pot after the collards cooked down low and slow for hours with a hunk of smoked pork. That liquid was where all the vitamins went, all the minerals, everything the greens had to give. And here's the thing, the history books leave out. Collard greens, in the plantation system, were often the only vegetable enslaved people were permitted to grow for themselves in whatever small garden plot they were allowed after a full day's forced labor. The greens grew easy in poor soil. They survived frost. They kept a family fed through winter when nothing else would grow. So the cooks took what would grow and turned it into something with dignity. Hours of slow simmering, a little onion if you had it. And that pot liquor became its own kind of medicine, sipped straight from a cup or soaked into a piece of cornbread, crumbled right down into the pot. You won't see that today. Most folks boil greens for 20 minutes and call it done. They don't know what they're missing. They don't know that pot liquor was keeping whole families alive through months when meat was a memory and money was less than that. Number 3, skillet cornbread. The real kind, no sugar in it. Here's something that'll surprise you if you grew up on the sweet cake-like cornbread that comes out of a box today. The original cornbread, the one enslaved cooks made in cast iron over an open hearth, had no sugar in it at all. None. Sugar was expensive, and it wasn't theirs to spend freely. What they had was corn, Corn was the ration. Corn was what the plantation system doled out because it was cheap to grow and cheap to store. And they turned that one ingredient into something with real character. Cornmeal, water, or buttermilk if there was any to spare. A little fat, poured into a skillet that had been sitting in the coals until it was near white hot. So the batter hit it with a sound like rain on a tin roof. That crust, that dark, almost burnt crust on the bottom. That was the whole point. That's where the flavor lived. Sweet cornbread came later, up north, in kitchens with sugar to spare, and no memory of what the dish was built to do in the first place, which was stretch one cheap grain into a meal that could feed a family 3 times a day if it had to. Number 4, Hoppin John. Now this one, family, this one carries something sacred in it. Black-eyed peas and rice cooked together with a little pork for flavor, and eaten on New Year's Day for luck in the year ahead. That tradition didn't start in South Carolina. It started across the ocean in West Africa, where rice and peas cooked together was already an old and honored dish long before the first ship ever crossed. Enslaved West Africans, many of them specifically brought to the Carolinas because the planters knew they already had rice-growing expertise the planters themselves did not, carried that dish in their memory, in their hands, because you can take a person across an ocean in chains, but you cannot take what they know how to cook. Hoppin John became a New Year's ritual because black-eyed peas, in the scarcity of enslaved life, were one of the only foods reliably available in the dead of winter. Eating them on the first day of the year wasn't superstition invented out of nowhere. It was gratitude, dressed up as tradition, for a food that had carried people through the leanest month of the year, generation after generation. Number 5. Okra. You cannot tell the story of Southern food without okra, and you cannot tell the story of okra without West Africa. That plant did not grow wild in the American South. It came across the Middle Passage, sometimes literally in the hair of enslaved women, seeds braided into their scalp because that was one of the only ways to smuggle a piece of home onto a slave ship. Once it took root in southern soil, okra became the backbone of dishes that thickened a thin broth into something that could actually fill a stomach. Fried okra, stewed okra, okra dropped into a pot of tomatoes and onions. Every version of it traces back to women who refused to let go of a plant their grandmothers grew, even while everything else was being stripped away from them. Number 6, Gumbo. And that brings us to Gumbo, which is really just okra's biggest stage. The word itself, Gumbo, comes from a Central African word for okra, ki ngombo. Down in Louisiana, African cooking knowledge, French roux technique, and indigenous filet powder came together in one pot, built almost entirely by enslaved and free black cooks working in Creole kitchens, where they did the actual cooking, while somebody else's name went on the household ledger as the cook of the house. Every bowl of gumbo served in New Orleans today, in restaurants with James Beard awards on the wall, carries the fingerprint of women whose names were never recorded anywhere except in the recipe itself, passed mouth to mouth, hand to hand, because that was the only kind of inheritance available to them. Number 7, chitlins. Now let's talk about what happens after the hog is killed. When a plantation slaughtered a pig, the meat, the good cuts, the ham, the loin, went to the big house. What was left for the enslaved people who did the actual killing and butchering was what the planters didn't want. The intestines, the feet, the ears, the parts that most folks today wouldn't even look at twice. And out of that, black cooks built an entire cuisine of what we now call soul food. Chitlins, the cleaned and slow-cooked intestines, took hours of careful preparation, hours of washing and simmering and seasoning, to turn something discarded into something a family could sit down to and be proud of. That's not a small thing, family. That's alchemy. That's taking what somebody else called garbage and turning it into Sunday dinner. Number 8, pig's feet. Same story, different cut. Pickled or slow braised until the meat fell clean off the bone, pig's feet were another throwaway piece transformed by patient hands into something rich and satisfying. Big Mama used to say waste wasn't a word she was allowed to know. Everything got used. Everything got honored. The feet, the ears, the tail, the neck bones. Every piece of that animal got turned into a dish. Somebody sat down and ate with gratitude, because gratitude was one of the only things nobody could take away from you. Number 9, cracklin' cornbread. When that hog fat got rendered down for cooking oil, what was left behind were little crispy bits of pork skin, cracklins. And instead of throwing those away, cooks folded them straight into their cornbread batter, so every bite carried little pockets of crunch and smoky pork flavor running through the corn. It turned a ration food into something with texture, something with surprise in it. That's the whole story of this cuisine right there, family. Surprise built out of scarcity. Joy built out of what was left over. Now, before we keep going, I want to hear from you, family. Out of everything we've covered so far, the hoecakes, the greens, the gumbo, the chitlins, which one takes you straight back to somebody's kitchen? Whose hands made it for you? Drop that name in the comments. Not just the dish, the name of the person who made it. I read every single one, and I promise you, somebody else in these comments is going to see that name and remember their own. Number 10. Buttermilk biscuits. After emancipation, when black families started building their own households, their own kitchens, their own tables for the first time, with any say over what went on them, the biscuit became something close to sacred. Flour, buttermilk, a little lard, worked with a light hand because Big Mama always said, heavy hands make heavy biscuits. She never measured, she felt the dough. She knew by touch when it was right. And every Sunday morning, that biscuit was proof. Proof that a family that had been told for generations they owned nothing could now own a kitchen, a table, a recipe passed down on nobody's terms but their own. Number 11. Candied yams. Sweet potatoes, cooked down slow with brown sugar, butter, and warm spice until they turned glossy and rich enough to serve as a dessert or a side, depending on who you asked. That sweetness carries an old West African tradition of treating root vegetables, yams especially, with reverence, treating them as worthy of ceremony, not just survival. By the time sweet potatoes were candied on a southern black table, they weren't just food anymore. They were a way of saying, we still know how to make something beautiful, even here. Number 12. Black-eyed peas on their own, off the New Year's table. Beyond the ritual of Hoppin John, black-eyed peas showed up in soups, in stews, simmered slow with a little salt pork all year round. Because they were cheap, they stored well, and they filled a stomach when nothing fancier was on hand. That plant, too, traveled across the ocean from Africa, and it became one of the quiet, everyday foundations of survival in the rural South. Not glamorous, not written about, just reliable, the way a good grandmother is reliable. Number 13. Fried catfish. Down by the river on a Friday night, there was a sound and a smell that meant something good was about to happen. Hot grease popping in a cast iron pot. Cornmeal-crusted catfish going in golden and coming out gold. Fish fries became one of the few social gatherings enslaved and later free black communities could hold on their own terms. Because the fish came free from the river, and a little cornmeal went a long, long way. Those fish fries turned into church fundraisers, into juke joint traditions, into an entire social fabric built around a fried piece of catfish and the people gathered close enough to share it. Now, family, let me tell you something real quick before we go any further. What I'm sharing with you tonight, these are pieces of a much bigger story that almost got erased completely. I put together something called the Soul Roots Cookbook, 100 Forgotten Black American Recipes, written out the way Big Mama would have done it, complete, patient, and true, with the stories behind them included, not just the ingredients. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments. You can also scan the code on your screen right now, if that's easier for you. Don't let these recipes disappear the way so much else already has. Number 14. Carolina Gold Rice. Family, this next one might be the clearest example of theft in this entire list, so listen close. The rice industry that made South Carolina one of the wealthiest colonies in all of British North America was built entirely on the rice-growing expertise of enslaved West Africans, brought specifically from rice-growing regions of Senegambia and Sierra Leone, because planters knew, and admitted in their own letters, that they themselves did not know how to cultivate rice. Enslaved people engineered the irrigation systems, understood the tidal flooding, knew how to process the grain by hand, with mortar and pestle techniques carried straight from home. Carolina Gold Rice built fortunes for men, whose names are still on buildings and street signs today. The people who actually knew how to grow it are barely a footnote. Number 15. Whole hog barbecue, cooked low over a pit. Barbecue, the way it's celebrated across the South, today with festivals and championships and cookbooks bearing famous pitmaster names, was built on techniques developed and perfected almost entirely by enslaved black men who were assigned, forced, to manage the pits for plantation feasts and celebrations. Digging the pit, managing the coals for hours through the night, knowing exactly how low and how slow to cook a whole hog until the meat pulled apart on its own. That knowledge was skilled labor, technical labor, and it was performed for the entertainment and the appetite of people who owned the men doing it. When barbecue became a Southern institution, celebrated in magazines and on television, the credit went almost entirely elsewhere. Number 16. Vinegar-based barbecue sauce. The thin, sharp, peppery vinegar sauce associated with Eastern Carolina barbecue traces directly back to enslaved cooks who didn't have access to sugar or tomatoes in any real quantity, so they built flavor out of what was cheap and available. Vinegar, pepper, salt. That sharp, cutting sauce that barbecue historians still argue about today. City against city, region against region, it started as ingenuity born of scarcity. Not a stylistic choice made in a test kitchen. Number 17. Fried chicken. Now, this dish carries a weight most folks don't fully understand. Fried chicken has a complicated history. Chicken was one of the only animals enslaved people were sometimes permitted to raise for themselves, because chickens were cheap and low status in the eyes of plantation owners. That small permission became an entire culinary tradition. Sunday chicken, fried in cast iron, seasoned with whatever spice a family could get their hands on, became the centerpiece of the one meal each week a family actually got to plan and control themselves. And yet this dish, born out of one of the only spaces of autonomy black families were allowed, became, in the wrong hands, a cruel stereotype instead of what it actually was, a symbol of ownership, of skill, of a Sunday table that belonged to nobody but the family sitting at it. Number 18. Macaroni and cheese. Family, I want you to hear this name, because most folks never learn it. James Hemmings, an enslaved man owned by Thomas Jefferson, trained in French culinary technique in Paris while enslaved, who is widely credited with introducing macaroni and cheese to American tables after bringing the pasta-making machine and the recipe back from France. He cooked it, he perfected it, he served it at Monticello. And for over 200 years, the dish that shows up on nearly every Black Sunday dinner table in this country, baked golden with a crust on top, has been treated in popular history as a generic Southern comfort food with no author at all. When it has an author, family, it has a name, James Hemmings. Now family, you've been here with me through most of this video, and that tells me something about you. It tells me you understand that what we're talking about is not just food. It's a record of who built this country's table and never got invited to sit at the head of it. I know some of you are thinking, I already know these dishes, I grew up eating them. What more is there to learn? Family, I've been doing this long enough to know that the people who still remember the deep stories behind these recipes are getting older every single year. And once they're gone, the story goes with them, unless somebody writes it down. That's why I put together the Soul Roots Cookbook. 100 recipes, written out complete the way Big Mama made them, with every tip and every piece of history included. You can keep relying on memory alone, hoping somebody in the family writes it down eventually. Or you can have it all in one place, preserved the right way, starting today. The link is in the description and pinned right up top in the comments. Scan the code on your screen if that's easier. I did my part. The rest is yours. Number 19. Jambalaya. Down in Louisiana, jambalaya grew out of the same Creole kitchens as gumbo. Rice, whatever meat or seafood was on hand. Tomatoes if there were any. All cooked together in one pot, because one pot was often all a family had. Free and enslaved black cooks in New Orleans built this dish into a full meal out of leftovers and Sunday abundance, blending West African one-pot cooking traditions with Spanish and French influence, and turning it into a dish that today gets marketed as simply Louisiana cuisine. The specific hands behind it smoothed out of the story entirely. Number 20. Chow chow. This one's quieter, family, but just as important. Chow chow, a tangy vinegar-pickled relish made from whatever vegetables were left at the end of a harvest. Cabbage, green tomatoes, peppers, onions, chopped fine, and put up in jars to last through winter. Was how black families in the rural South stretched a garden's bounty across months when fresh food simply wasn't available. A spoonful on top of a plate of peas and cornbread turned a plain meal into something with brightness in it. Every jar on that shelf was a woman's insurance policy against a hungry February. Number 21. Peach cobbler, sweet but never wasteful. When peaches came in season, more of them than a family could eat fresh. Cooks folded them into a biscuit-style dough, baked low and slow until the fruit bubbled up through the crust, deep amber and sticky. It stretched a short season of fruit into something that felt like celebration, made with the same ration flour and fat used for everything else that week, just arranged with a little more love because it was meant for the whole family gathered together. Number 22. Sweet potato pie. Now, family, this one is close to sacred in a lot of houses, and for good reason. Sweet potato pie became the signature holiday dessert in Black Southern households, not because it was easy. It took real skill, boiling and mashing the potatoes just right, balancing the spice, getting that crust to hold, but because sweet potatoes were reliably available when other fruit wasn't, and because that root vegetable carried the same West African reverence we talked about earlier with candied yams. To this day, in kitchens all across this country, there is a real and serious argument about whether pumpkin pie or sweet potato pie belongs on the holiday table. And most folks who grew up in a black household will tell you there was never actually a debate at all. If this brought something back for you, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you're here every single time we sit down at this table together. And drop a comment for me. Out of these 25, which dish did your family get exactly right, the same way, generation after generation? Tell me the name of the person who taught it to you. I read every single one of them. Number 23. Banana pudding, layers of vanilla custard, sliced bananas, and vanilla wafer cookies, chilled until the wafers went soft and cake-like. That dessert became a Southern black household staple, built at home, generation after generation, long before a cookie company ever printed a version of that recipe on the back of a box and let the world believe they'd invented it. The homemade version, with real custard cooked slow on the stovetop, not instant pudding from a box, still exists in kitchens today, made by women who never once needed a company's permission to know they'd built something good. Number 24. Red beans and rice. Every Monday, in households all across Louisiana and beyond, red beans went into the pot to simmer low and slow all day long, with a ham bone left over from Sunday dinner. Because Monday was traditionally wash day, and a woman doing laundry by hand all day long needed a meal that could take care of itself, while she took care of everything else. That's not a coincidence, family. That's a whole system of domestic knowledge, timed and planned around the rhythm of a working woman's week, turned into a tradition so beloved it's still served on Mondays in restaurants across New Orleans to this day, most of them with no idea why. Number 25. The whole Sunday table itself. And this is the one I want to leave you with, family, because it's not really a dish. It's everything we've talked about tonight, sitting together on one table, at one time, built by one family. The fried chicken next to the mac and cheese, next to the candied yams, next to the greens, with their pot liquor still steaming, the biscuit stacked warm under a cloth, the sweet potato pie waiting on the counter for after grace was said. That table, that exact table, is what got packaged up decades later and sold to the entire world as Southern comfort food, served in restaurants with white owners and glossy menus, written up in magazines that never once mentioned an enslaved rice grower, or a woman with a hoe blade over an open fire, or James Hemmings standing in a kitchen in Paris, learning a technique he'd bring home and give to a country that would spend the next 2 centuries forgetting his name. Every dish on that table has an author, every single one. And tonight, I hope you know a few more of their names than you did an hour ago. Share this one with somebody in your family who still makes Sunday dinner the real way, from scratch, the way it was always meant to be made. Let them know somebody's still telling the truth about where it all came from. Subscribe, because next time, we're going somewhere just as real as tonight. This food was never just food, family. It was inheritance. It was proof. It was a people saying, with nothing but a fire and a skillet and their own two hands, we were here, and we built something the whole world would one day eat from, even if the whole world forgot to say thank you. I'll see you next time, family.